Welcome all for today's session on Micro Frontend. I hope this is going to be very interesting session. And with me, I have Hashan, uh, who has worked with me for around last 8 years. And we have been seeing this Micro Frontend story for quite a long time. So the whole idea is to share our experiences and our learnings during this uh, several years, so that you can also get some thoughts around this and have some clarifications around different misconceptions, best practices, and some planning around whether you should work with micro front end, things like that. So before we start, let's wait maybe some few minutes for others to turn around. Then we will start and walk through the session. Yeah, so I will start with the proceedings. So let me start with, this is the most common understanding of the developers, engineers, and the professionals in the society about how the systems were evolved from the monolithic system to micro front-end architecture. I mean, if you look at the term, it has been there for quite some time, since 2016, like very first time when ThoughtWorks, when they announced this concept of micro front-end on their radar. And it was developed as like breaking the monolith on the front end. I mean, we have seen that the layered architectures from the into the microservices that has been happening for last several years. And later we realized, okay, there's a front end monolith that we need to break apart. Otherwise, we cannot have this micro front end technology. That is how we have pursued this as professionals, most of us. But it's like when I look at our experience for last 12 years, so my understanding about micro front end, rather than looking at this as a concept of breaking the front end monolith, this concept of micro front end is a concept around managing growth complexities. When you are building a product or several years of time, so products get bigger, and sometimes you get them very unmanageable, right? So then you get these scaling issues, and sometimes you get like how you manage your large codes, monorepos, and conflict management, and the time you spend in build, testing, deployment. So you have so much of efficiency issues around your product, which causing very difficult to grow. So that is how I today see. I mean, I will go through all these slides and explain you what I'm talking about. So around 12 years ago, so we partnered with one ERP vendor in Norway. The goal was to modernize their ERP platform. So it has been grown up as a internal ERP system for a single company, and initially started as the electronic stock control system, and gradually brought up into the other several pieces of electronic manufacturing ERP system, which was owned by a single company, and it has been used for their internal ERP operations. But at some point they realized, okay, this is a very feature-rich application, but there are some challenges for further growth. I mean, when you have a product for a simple company, if you have to grow it, grow the business, So they have to find out a mechanism. So they realize, okay, we have a very feature-rich ERP platform. Why don't we make it more B2B type of product where you can put into their partner customers rather than only used by a single company. So that was the thinking, and it was planned to bring more sales by doing that. So it's a kind of a re-architecting of the platform, targeting more business, and that was the original thought. So it's clearly a business scaling problem rather than a technology scaling problem. So this is one very triggering point for me, like when I look at the decisions we take everyday life as programmers. I mean, this is one trigger where the micro front end and these growth aspects, those are not necessarily be a technology driven decisions. So this is clearly a business driven decision. So the initial thoughts were like, when you doing such a business scale, so number one, you have to make a cloud architecture in a way that you can facilitate multiple tenants, right? So you should have uh, different tenants for each customer, where you can grow and sell for large number of customer bases, and also so multi-language support, multi-currency support, and multi-tenancy, multi-regional support, and feature scaling. I mean, when you do this kind of scaling, so you need to facilitate this product with large number of features to satisfy this large client spectrum. So that was the initial thought and initial goals, right? And to build up a product from a simple scale, like a simple company managed product into a international, this kind of scalable product. So you cannot follow simple code repositories, the typical product management practices. So you have to build up your structures and everything to support that. And that is where we start thinking about how we structure our code solutions. So we thought of initially, so we need to have a platform which extend this ERP functionalities through services, APIs. So kind of the micro service stage where you build up your ERP functionality using microservices. And also on top of that, you develop some kind of a PaaS, platform as a service, where the partner developers can develop ERP applications. Because when you have large number of organizations in your product to deploy, so you have to develop things at a very rapid scale. So you cannot do this using an internal team, right? So you have to bring new partners, development partners in different, and maybe it's different companies or different regions, but the idea is you have to have a mechanism to scale up your development abilities, and for that you have to have a platform, the application develop platform to rapid application development. So that is one of our first step during this journey, right? So that when you have this, the partner developers can develop platforms at a very rapid application speed, right? Then another requirement was like, when you have this kind of scaling, if you design your product only to support large enterprises, that's also a big challenge, because then you have to limit your businesses only with large clients. But they also need like a spectrum of clients, right? So you should be able to design the product to support small retail type of businesses, as well as mid-sized businesses, and also large enterprises where you have these large factories, retail chains. So these are the spectrum. So your architecture should be able to scale and also should be able to shrink, right? So you understand this concept, right? And also the different form factors. So your product should support different screen sizes and different devices, like mobile, then these different iPads, like different size form factor devices. So there is another factor which we need to scale, right? So if you look at overall what what kind of scaling aspects we need to do. So without having a single code base or single service type of monolithic application, you cannot do this, right? So what we initially did was we start breaking up the whole it was not really a monolithic application, but we had to expose the internal services, ERP application services, as microservices. That's our first step in this journey. So it's like well domain aligned microservices, right? So we were very clear that all our services has to be domain aligned. When I say domain aligned, so it's like key feature areas like sales, finance, logistics, then rental. So all our services are initially aligned as domain aligned microservices. But then we realize, okay, on the front end still we have a JSON hungry interfaces where you serve as a very flat. It's a UI. I would say it's a UI monolith rather, right? So then this next step is how do you break your front end to have a end-to-end thin slices reflecting these domain aligned services, right? So that was our next goal. Then we realized, okay, our front end development platform has to support this decomposition the apps into components and micro components, right? And also, so when you design these internal codes, we have to be very clear that we follow something like clean architecture principles. Like I think I am not going to explain you what exactly these clean architecture principles are, but it is you start your design the domain as your first class citizen, and you structure your code at each level. Like if you slice your code at different levels, if you slice it at front end, if you slice it at service level and data structure level, so you can see the business structure. That means you can see these sales, finance kind of domain aligned structures at each level, so that you can isolate these pieces end to end, and you can take it out as a different piece, right? That is the idea behind thinking behind you splitting this whole thing into micro services and front ends, right? So this was a stage wise approach that we have followed, and the next step was how do you make sure that your deployment process and build process is lean, right? So when you it doesn't matter if you even break your whole code and structures into tiny pieces, but you have to make sure that your build structures are very efficient. So we thought of, okay, we have to have component level and this micro piece level uh, developer pipelines, so where each piece you can build and deploy independent, right? Not as the whole big structure, but if you take, let's say, your sales microservice, you should be able to build that individual piece and deploy it in isolation. So your build time, if you have to make any fix on your sales microservice, so it should be a matter of minutes, right? And the build time is very so you can increase the efficiency by breaking it down into pieces, right? And the way we structured our front end to support this, right? So we have kind of, if you take any application in this environment, you have a component based layout. Even your final application looks like a complex application, but if you break it into parts, so these are thin slices, right? So you have these thin components which wire up together to build your whole application, right? So in this way, you can easily, you can have component developers who will develop your individual components that are reusable, and also you have layout developers and application assemblers who will compose these applications by using these pre-built components. And you can do very interesting application prototypes, and you can validate, and you can do this alpha and beta testing with different layouts. So that also speed up the fast prototyping abilities of the designers. And also you can validate, like sometimes you can reject, like, okay, this version doesn't have the necessary user experience, so you can reject it, right? So you can see even the design time activities, develop time activities, they have become a very efficient, fast moving cycles, right? So now if you look at the whole story together, like the breakdown and the structural rearrangement what we have done, so you can see it's like your application is your whole masterpiece, and it's based upon components, multiple components, and these components are end-to-end thin slices, right? So these are micro. I mean, the application, it's not only the application, even inside application, you can have micro front ends, which will slice the entire end-to-end, the services and the backend services, the archives, data structures, everything is domain aligned and it's sliced. And also these are you each of these has its own delivery pipeline, so that if you want to fix something, let's say if you do a change in your finance application middleware, so you can just deploy that piece and it will go into your different environment, dev environment, test environment, production, so you can have this very good propagation of these pieces, right? So, and now the question is, how do you orchestrate? Like, okay, well, you can have micro pieces, but then of course you have to have a, let's say if you directly let your developers to connect your backend services, right? So they can follow their own standards. So which will end up your different micro pieces, these micro front ends in different styles, right? So they can have their own standards. They will use their own technologies. So that was a challenge, right? So what we did was, so we start thinking of, we need to develop something in between as an orchestrator. So we developed a orchestrator platform or client application development platform, so that these developers, they cannot have their own style of development, right? Because we need to have some kind of governance. How do you connect your components with your backend? That has to be a standard. And what is the styling or themes? How do you control that uniformity between these components, different people? So otherwise your application will look like, okay, one part of your UI will have a one user experience, and the other one will have a completely different user experience. But we have to have some kind of governance. So this client application development platform layer, uh, we embedded all those standards and these different integration principles into this platform, right? And also it's so important, like how do you connect? Like, okay, you can have thin slices across domain aligned slices, but let's say you have to do some cross communication, right? You have to do some transactions between probably shipping, inventory, and account services. So how do you handle that, right? So those are the common questions, like when you break your system into these thin layers, so you need to have a mechanism. So we have built some mechanisms, the backend operations, which can consume these microservices in a transactional manner. So these operations will take care of transaction revert and how do you run the sequence that that you can control using this. It can be a back end work, and also that transaction logic you can have a part of the back end or front end. We called it part of the orchestrator, and on the front end you can manage that logic. So these are different ways you can handle cross microservice operations. Yeah. So overall, if you look at, I mean, if I ask from a developer what is micro front end and what is microservices, usually they see it as okay, I am breaking my front end monolith, right? And also someone could say, okay, it's a good way to break down the system and decompose the system into multiple pieces. But if I look at what exactly we have done, like we took more than 4 or 5 years to build up this whole system. But what we have really done is the growth management of the product. And when you have a rapid growth into your product, so maybe it comes from your investor board, maybe it's something given by your management team, the instruction. But what you are doing is basically the growth. When you do this kind of growth management, how you structure your code, how you break your application into pieces. So that is how we have to think about the micro front end. And often, like when I see customers today, so they often ask, should I go into micro front end or not, right? So these are the typical situations that we have to face when we have these kind of assignments. So I think we have to be very clear. You cannot take these kind of decisions just by looking at the technology. So that is one of the biggest message I have to give, because all these kind of decomposition, breakdown, structuring, and this require massive infrastructure, massive code refactorings, and massive platform developments, which take a lot of money and a lot of budgets, right? So you have to first think what exactly you are doing, right? So in this situation, it was very clear that they wanted to go from a single loan company product into international market with large number of users, and that is how they earn money, and that is how they have planned to develop their business, right? So when you drill it down into technology, then you realize, okay, micro front end is a better approach, right? By doing this, you can break whole system into parts. And very interestingly, I mean, things like you will have teams who will work on different isolations. Like the final result, I think what we are talking today is mostly the final results. Like as developers, what we are talking is, okay, independent teams who work with their own technology in their own product. So those are the different stories I usually hear, right? But you have to see what kind of impact that will have, right? I can bring one other example. I mean, often I see if we adapt micro front end, we can use whatever the technology that we like to do, right? So we can work on very latest technology. Those are the different stories that developers will say, right? But if you look at how do you manage governance in such a case, how do you manage security, and how do you make sure that your code is very secure? So organization need to have a common standard. So you cannot follow different teams following different technologies as they want, right? Because the technology is good. So that shouldn't be the decision, but it has to be come from the top. And you can say, okay, for this reason, we are aligning to use this technology. And we have to have uniformity, and you have to have uniformity how you style your application. So there are a lot of governance that you have to place on top of the micro front ends. If you are splitting the system into this full stack microservices, I will say, right? So but today most of us we are talking is the byproduct of this. So think through the whole story, right? That will give you a better understanding. So if I look at what is we have received after doing all these things, right? So now I can see we have independent 15 independent teams driving their own product area, like things like finance application. You have a different team who's specialized in finance, and they know exactly how to test, and they know exactly how this end user is using finance application. So we have very specialized people who working on specific domain areas. Whereas at the beginning, you have a big product and people are all over. So, right? So you see the benefit of this part. And the growth wise, now we have customers like B2B business with around 74 customers with more than 5,000 active users who are using these features, right? And also see the amount of components, right? So 3,000 plus components. These are the different micro pieces I am talking about, right? So if you have any, let's say, a fix something you have to do in the product. So what you do is you pick one piece which is very tiny, and you do a fix on that, either that on that component or supporting microservice, and then you deploy it. It's matter of it's matter of minutes and hours what we are talking about, not days and months anymore, right? So that level of breakdown is there, right? And the collaboration, you have large scale development partners who are working from 3 different countries. So your development speed is very high. And 17 business modules. This is the feature enhancements. You have finance and all these ERP modules. And look at the number of commits and daily velocity of the developer. So this kind of, I know there are systems like this more than this rate, but we have to compare what it has been several years ago and how it works now, right? So this is the transition that we make using Micro Frontend. It's not about the breaking the monolith. It's about the business efficiency, profits, and your clarity of your code and how testable and how specialized your teams are. So these are the things that we are going to achieve by doing this, right? Yes, I think up to this, I have at very high level, I have talked about the uh, business and the technology architectural aspect of it. And with me, I have Hashan, who will show you some technical implementation side of it if you are moving into this area. Uh, but later we will have some Q&A, like after this tech demo, we will have a Q&A. So let's move into our tech demo by Hashan.
Okay. Let's go. Yeah. Okay. So just before we go into the demo, let's kind of have a bit of walkthrough on which tools and frameworks are available to us and what was available a couple of years back. The thing is, like micro frontends, even the term came to use in 2016, so this is not a very old technology, and we started trying toying with it, I think, around 2018 first. So at that time, this was not a very widely available term, there were not much defined frameworks there. So then there were like concepts like monorepo, which use tools like Learner to create the monorepos to facilitate these micro frontends. So the Webpack Module Federation, Single Spark, and custom elements, so which was kind of like a framework based implementations of what we say web components now. So each technology used to implement their own version of web components back then under the name of custom elements. So if you use Angular, you would have one implementation, and if you use React, you would have another implementation. And also iframes, like the most old tool that we could use to render another application inside our currently running application. And now we have a lot of available tools and frameworks. So some of the previously available frameworks and tools have been matured, have become more matured now, like Single Spark, Module Federation. So those has come a long way, and are kind of like full-fledged enterprise level supporting um, um, to frameworks now. And in addition to that, we have web components, which is a common kind of an agreement between all the frameworks, technologies to implement custom elements in a generic and a methodical way. Also, we have things like lit elements, the bit framework, Spiral, VG, Mosaic, open components, and then also these are some of the most widely used frameworks. So other than this, there can be many new tools and technologies as well. But for the purposes of this presentation, we are not going through all of them. Yeah. So until we slide. Now there are lot of, as you saw probably saw, there are a lot of tools and frameworks to achieve implementing micro frontends now, but there are some considerations we have to do when we go through these frameworks and technologies make this possible. So they usually provide end-to-end solutions for like creating, operating, and maintaining your front-end micro front-end based application. But there can be issues with performance, like when you compare the features that you get versus the performance that you get. So there can be some differences there, and also simplicity. So some approaches can be a bit difficult to understand for the developers and the first time, or until they are familiarized with the approach. And also sometimes they are limited to the framework or the technology they have chosen. So if you are stick to one particular approach to implement micro frontend, so that can be your selected approach for the time being. And if you want to try out another approach, then it can be a bit tedious task to do. So the question is, why can't we do this ourselves? So we can actually do that. And let's see a simple plan to implement our own version of a micro front end that only uses vanilla TypeScript and whichever frameworks that you want to. So in this case, I have chosen React and Vue as developing components, but this is running inside like pure TypeScript application. So we have a app TS file, a menu, a router, and a simple service. So what this app does is app TS, it will just render our menu and our router. So these are implemented as web components themselves. So you can just plug in any um, if you have like a framework for a particular menu that you would like, a UI widget library or anything that you can plug in into the menu, or if you have a router implementation in a different framework, you can do that also. What the router does is, so this is where kind of like the magic happens. So the router will handle route changes. Also, it will act as kind of like a renderer, which will take into account what's the app or the link that the user is trying to get into. And then it will pick out the components which belongs to that application, and then it will render them in the UI. So for my for the purposes of this demo, one of these components is this React component. It will be a list of, for this purpose, we have chosen a list of heroes. So it will display the list of heroes, and it will be obtained through this service, which also runs through this TypeScript shell. And then when we select a particular hero, it will emit a custom event, which is also available in JavaScript now. And then the view web component will show the details of that particular hero. Okay, so then we'll go to the demo. Okay, so this is the running version of the demo. So we have a dashboard and another application which has some web components. So this dashboard is just some HTML. It doesn't have anything. But when we go to the application, so you can see that it renders two different components. The left-hand side, as I mentioned, is a React component, which shows a list of heroes. And when we click on a hero on this list, so it will update this view component in the right-hand side, and you can see the data is being updated as we select. Yeah, so this is just like a very basic implementation of content which we can do without even using any of the frameworks or tools, using just TypeScript and some bundling tools like Rollup. We can bundle the React and Vue components separately, and then just use it, and the dependencies will be resolved in the runtime. So I guess that concludes presentation.
Yeah, I think with this we can open up for the forum for questions. If you have any, and I'm just so when you look at this components, the implementation. So this is kind of a one part of it. Like if you want to like to understand how you break down your front end. That's why we have created this demo. But I think most of you are well aware of the microservice part of it, the how you break down service layer and the backend layers. So those are very much common, and that has been there for many years. So this part reflects what we can do to break the front end monolith of the systems.
Yeah, and also if I just show the bundle sizes, we can actually using like tree shaking and also like using like externals, we can drastically reduce the bundle sizes as well. So this 143 KB is actually the bundle size with React, but we can remove the React from bundle and then just include that in the runtime also dynamically. So you can check and see like if your application has a React component, then on the fly you can load the React. So like that, it gives the developers, the teams, the flexibility to use a technology that they're familiar with, and depending on the context, so we might need to use different technologies as well. Yeah.
So to make it the questions, I also can share some thoughts around. Let's say there can be two types of projects that you need to think through whether we need a micro front end or not, right? So there can be companies or products which are already in the monolith category. That means you have a very bulky product, very hard to manage, and you want to go through the cycle which I have explained, right? So you will need to break down it into microservices, and so that you have to plan that kind of work. You have to plan as a, I mean, so side by side you have to run it and try this kind of out. And also there can be, are we getting any questions?
When developing micro frontend, is it a good thing to stick into a single tech stack instead of going for multiples?
Yeah, yeah. I think very good question, right? So my experience. So I think we went through the same journey, right? So as techies, we would like always love to adhere different technologies, right? And you can have people with different skills on different technologies, but the problem is all around the governance, right? If your product is really large, like ERP product, enterprise product with large business, large customer base, maintaining multiple technologies and multiple implementation styles adapted by individual developers. I mean, I have my own writing style and I have my own preferences for technologies, and Hashan may have different technology preferences. But as a government organization, like a large organization, you cannot let it happen, right? So you have to make sure some level of uniformity to make sure that the code that you write is clean and structured. So say if we follow multiple technologies, that adherence will be really hard, right? The code reviews and how you adapt to the standards. So that brings a lot of management, right? So it's fascinating for everyone to use their own technology. That's very I mean fairy tale kind of stories that always we hear on top of this micro front end. But when it comes to business, I think it's a decision of the CTO or directors of the company to see how it will impact to the business by adapting these multiple technologies. I don't think it's, I can say this is good or bad. Rather, you have to assess it and see what are the consequences, right? So if some technology gives better over another, so definitely you have to adapt and do that transition with proper assessment and governance. But because of developers are demanding, I don't think that is not the way. I mean, I'm tempting to use new technology all the time, right? But I can't because that's a massive business risk with that, right? So that is my takeaway.
I think one case we can, I think we also did this initially. So we actually tried to use run Angular and Angular 2 at that time within the same application. So that's how we got into this whole custom elements at that time, I think. So in kind of like a migration scenario, then you can absolutely try that and see like if the new technology is a good fit for you, whether it is easy to develop and then suits and whether
it has to driven through a rationale. I mean, if it brings the speed and the performance, maybe with new technologies you have a lot of benefits, right? So if you have a good rationale, then you can adapt that new technology as a transition, but not to I mean to make development team satisfied. So it has to be a business satisfaction, right? So that is role of more of a CTO, then or maybe tech leads, architects, kind of people to assess it and introduce. So I think we also shouldn't stay in a one technology, and also it's a duty of the team and the architects to make sure that you retire technologies. Like if your micro front ends are written in a bit old technology, I mean, you can very easily replace new micro front ends because we are talking about small pieces now, right? So you can try it out and gradually you can introduce that technology to other pieces, right?
Next question from Patum. What do you recommend for Angular and React module federation? I think that depends on your context and your needs, and you know what if you are already familiar with module federations and Webpack and kind of like the internals of it, because so module federation you have kind of like two different sides of modules which talks to each other, and that like by some convention you have to go through it. So for some it can be a bit confusing at the start.
Yeah.
But module federation is only one approach.
One approach to go with.
So, what I think for any technology, the best thing to do is kind of go through the different approaches.
Yes.
See and maybe do some POCs with each one of them, and try and see like if this scales better and how does the team feels about it, and how do you feel about it. Yeah. Is the same question? Okay. Same. Okay, from the same.
And I also can add some experience here. I mean, if let's say you are a startup, right, and your product is already lean, and you have wrote in a very stringent manner, which is not so bulky, right, and there are tendency people to adapt micro front end when you expand features, right? Let's say you want to bring new feature into your existing lean startup, lean product, right? So maybe your first choice will be go with something like single spark, right? I mean, you have to look for what is cost effective at that point, right? So not don't plan like you don't plan it like in maybe 3 years time you may have large user base, yes, large customer base. So I mean, micro front end also can be incrementally adapted. I mean, if it takes iframe is the right choice at this moment and which is the most cost effective way, go for that as an intermediate solution, right? Meanwhile, try out other things, right? So if there's a real need to do complex orchestration and this writing up a micro front end framework for you, I think those cost money, right? So you cannot do it your own money, no? So it's about your investor or your management, whatever whose money, right? So you will get certain budgets, right? Plan for that. So there are I mean shortcuts where you can do to facilitate these incremental approaches. So look for what is feasible at this point rather than trying to look at writing a comprehensive micro front-end framework first. I think that is not the way we even today, I might say we have a very rich micro front-end framework, which we have invested for maybe 8 years, millions of money, right? So, but what you are doing today is you have a money constraints anyway, right? So look at those parameters first and try to.
Fathom has given some context for his question. Like he's saying, the problem with my question is we have bigger Angular project. We thought of introducing new features using React, this micro front-end architecture. Yeah. So I think first you have to see like if you have a big Angular project at the moment, whether it conforms to like basic necessities of introducing micro frontends, because you cannot introduce micro frontends overnight to a big monolithic application. So
And even I would like to hear whether when you say it's a bigger project, it's a bigger feature. So how does it scale? So you have to plan like when I describe in my story. So we had the need for scaling right from the design. By design, we had to scale for large customers, large feature set. But if you don't have all these things, better you think alternate intermediate way, right? Don't directly jump into the bandwagon.
Because micro frontends, you have to start from the bottom up. So you cannot start with the UI and go down to the service layer. So you have to start from the service layer itself and then come up to the UI.
Yes.
So if you have that decomposition already, like you have microservices and those kind of setup at the moment, then you can probably look into introducing microservices.
And introduce microservices and have multiple spas for each, when you have the front end decomposition, have multiple spas, right? So you can have that as and then you do something around the URL routing and everything. So from the outside, you will feel like actually it's a micro front end, but it's not the full-fledged MF.
But maybe single spa would be a better starting point, because like with single spa for different applications, you can use different repos.
Yeah.
So in that case, you can start implementing React for a separate application, and then using single spa, you can show that React application as needed.
Yeah. My experience also align with that. I mean, most of the time your backends are already micro service right? So that is the way people practice nowadays. So I can't imagine a new project you don't have the split, that service level split, right? So I think that's a good way to start and gradually move into this kind of very comprehensive micro front-end frameworks.
Okay. Next question from Venushka. As a whole, the app should provide similar UI UX to the users. What are the best practices to govern the styling and theming across all the front ends?
Yeah. In our case, we had this theming, the global theming strategy. So we into the our client application development framework, we use Kendo. Kendo theming as the uniform theming strategy. But if you take web components nowadays, for example, so you can have component level theming, right? So, but I think the right practice is you have to have a uniform theming across components. So you cannot have application look a different experience because of this component level split, right? So good to have a global theming theming approach.
Yeah, and now we can actually open up the shadow
DOM.
Yes, shadow DOM and the shadow root. So even if like what you see in the screen now also is both of these view these titles are same H1 tags but with different styling.
Okay.
That's just because the root is closed. But if you open the shadow root now, that's possible through web components. So you can just apply global stylings there, so without any issue. So it's just like by convention, it's better to have developers to some. We actually have a design guide that developers use. So in there, you can see how to let's say if you want to add an input to your component. So then in this design guide, it is purposefully mentioned how you should add this input into your component. So we have snippets available through IDEs that helps users to do this. So when you just type
intelligence,
yeah. So the actual typing or the custom styling for the from the developer's perspective is very minimal.
Yeah. I think good to have that kind of uniformity and governance, not only for security, not only for this styling, but even things like security. I think that is very important part when it comes to micro front end, because otherwise you will go out of control. Because the individual will follow their own standards, right? So you have to have the guidelines and maybe code snippet auto generation and validations to make sure that adherence. So it's a trade-off that we have to make. But a global theming work for us.
Yeah. From Teja, how are effective testing strategies implemented to ensure seamless integration and functionality across independent microfrontends? Yeah, I think so. With microfrontends, you can and should have separate deployment pipelines.
Yeah.
So for let's say if we have this application, so for these two components, I should have two different pipelines. So in that
test integrated.
yeah, and test integrated into that pipeline. So when you want to make this like if you add some new features with stable, and if you want to make it to the production, then you can write tests in the
test creation also pretty much easy. Now we are not talking about very large business features, because we are now talking about components and component integration. So I think testing has become a lot more easy, but we have to have a lot of tests covered.
Yeah. And since this is like independently run, it should be independently testable as well.
Yeah.
From Sitar, what are the practices that we should follow to keep the consistency of UI UX among? I think we probably have answered.
I think probably the design uniform design guidelines by a good UX engineer, assuming that even if you have a if you look take one this as a one application. I think that is how you have to design the design guidelines, not for individual pieces. Yeah. And I think uniformity is the key. Yeah. And the guidelines.
Like if you have a lot of diverse teams which are developing the components, then there should be like a lead level UX person who will oversee the application level user experience. So then it will not be that of a problem.
Yeah, and even like when we say different developers follow different standards, this is much more than that. I mean, now we are talking about teams for each functional area. Say if you have a finance application team in, let's say, Poland, they follow their own standards, and we here we follow our own standard. So this will be a very tough game, right? End of the day. So we have to have a very.
I think a good example is the date time format.
Yeah.
So like basically we probably might be used to like date, month, and year, and
from our cultural experience.
In there they might be using a different. So if we keep that in mind and we implement a date input with that particular format, then it would work in all the cases.
So I think you have to have a kind of UX lead who's responsible for the product, right? And leads responsible for the features, right? So between that cooperation, you have to make sure that okay, we had we have to have a uniform standard, and it has to be validated also, right?
As framework, Python is one option. What are the three best frameworks to go with? Yeah, I think then again it comes to what you are expecting, and like some of these frameworks they are not free, so there's a financial component is also involved. And seems like as I showed you, so this is not impossible with vanilla JavaScript or TypeScript. Now, this was not possible a couple of years back, but now this is actually possible. So,
and even like when you go to a very large enterprise product, so even when we try to adapt what is available, I think we wrote ourselves. That was the best that we came across, right? Yeah. Rather than, I mean, if your product is pretty small, I think you may not feel this, right? But if you are talking about a very enterprise level product, there can be some gaps in all these frameworks, right? Then, depending on the situation, you have to address it, right? So, what the approach we have gone through is we wrote the orchestration and this layer ourselves. So that worked for us. But always it's depending on your context and the problem you are trying to address.
Could you state the options for cross-application communications? Could take the one you demo. Yeah, so the one I demoed here, so it's using a thing called custom events, which is actually available in JavaScript now. Let me show you. Yeah, so this is custom event. So you can just create some event type with data and all, then you can listen to it from the, so you can see the examples. So you can create whatever the type of event that you want with some data, and then you can add an event listener to listen to this type of event, and then get the data and do stuff with. So that's what I'm actually doing now in this demo. And another way to do this is through the URL. By managing the URL, you can sync your components.
And it has to be, don't design a product to communicate component to the, I mean, don't design the product by the other components knowledge. So component has to be a listener and self-managed. So if you are designing a cost component communication, so one component has to broadcast it and others has to listen it. And while you listening, you have to handle how you behave to that event. It's not that you broadcast, you send a message to a specific component. So I think URL is a good place to handle this. So you make the changes on the URL, and there should be a service that listen to URL events and handle it. And component should implement how you react to the event changes.
Yeah, because even say like broadcasting events and listening also takes time. And
Yeah, it can impact the performance. I think URL is a good place to handle this actually.
Then again, you need to add some special handling for that also, because from the router level you can change the URL, but you need special handling from the component side to listen to that changes and then get whatever the changed values, and then you want to.
And the beauty of the URL is you can manage the history also, back and forth navigation, right? When you otherwise when you design this kind of framework, you may lose the power of the history, right? So you can preserve that also when you design URL as the key navigator. Yeah.
When it comes to cross-cutting functionalities like authentication and authorization, what are the options to inject them to different micro frontends from container application? Okay, I think from authentication and authorization wise, we are not injecting that into the component level. It's handled in the container application with the orchestration layer itself.
Yeah, I think the best way to do this so far, well, the way I found. So you can think like you have a shell for your application, right? So in all this, there you have a shell into your application. Then you have to couple your uh, authentication flow, and you integrate authentication into the shell of the application. That means when you are logged in, so basically you are inside your shell, right? Then you have this role-based access tokens, all these access token type of things where you pass into the component level activities. And also, I mean, in our case, we behind the API also we do a lot of role-based management that doesn't happen on the front-end layer. Like how do you control which rows you have access to depending on the role, and so there are a lot separate framework for that, which happens behind the API. But I think in the front end, what matters is the login and the short living access tokens that you issue into the APIs, short living operations.
Yeah, and the thing, another thing is like worrying about authentication and authorization is not part of the component developers' duties. So it should be actually handled from the platform.
Yeah. I mean, if it is handled in the front end layer, also the orchestrator, the layer has to take care of, not the component developers. So if you are designing component something related to authentication and authorization inside component, that means you are bringing that into the component developer, which is a wrong design principle, right? So try to avoid that. You can design the product in a way that you don't do that, right? So that then the governance becomes easy, right? Otherwise, I mean, when you have large teams, large number of developers, if everyone is going to take these kind of decisions, so that is pretty hard to manage the enterprise product. So have that thing, it has to be centralized, right?
Yeah. Okay, that's all the questions then. Yeah, like if you have any additional questions,
I think, yeah.
Just write to email or something.
Yeah. So you can, yeah, I think we will figure out a way to interact. If you have specific questions related to your projects, right? So I know that it's difficult to answer all the type of questions using this kind of webinar, but if you have any specific support or if you are struggling on some, so we can help you out. I mean, we can give some basic help. So I think we will figure out how to reach us, right? So, And also, thank you very much for your participation. And I hope you had a good learning out of sharing this experience. So, look to see you all in another session like this. Yeah. Have a great day.
Yeah, have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.